What is going on, everybody? So, just before Shadow of Erdtree was released, I was pretty eager to get another review out there, but then, after a few hours into the game, I just realized rushing through those kinds of games absolutely kills the vibe. So I slowed down to my regular pace with full understanding that by the moment I am done with it, nobody will care. As I was halfway through it, yet another difficulty debate imploded. I was eager to provide my take on the subject before I realized those opinions are like assholes. And I decided to use this difficulty debate as an opportunity to talk about a different but somewhat related topic. What makes a good boss fight? What elements do improve enjoyment or induce frustration? And does it have anything to actually do with difficulty? Before I dive deep into the matter, let's limit the scope. Lore, visuals, musics are incredibly important for the boss fight, I don't doubt that. Those can elevate mediocre fights or bring down a decent one. But for the purpose of this video, only mechanical aspects of the boss fight will be considered. So, in my opinion, it is obvious that difficulty is not directly correlated with how enjoyable a boss is. When the boss is difficult but not fun, the community marks it as frustrating or unfair. But let's put ourselves into a developer's shoes for a moment. Frustrating or unfair could be a valid criticism, but it is not really an actionable feedback. It is also not a very measurable parameter. And in my opinion, the most comprehensive metric for boss quality is a learning curve, or more precisely, how smooth is it? Let's put on the x-axis the time the player spends on the boss, and on the y-axis how far the player from defeating the boss, with 100 is when player actually beats it. Let's say we want an average player to defeat the boss in around 60 minutes. In the ideal world, the player experience will look something like this, where in the beginning there are a few simple attacks that player can learn so we can keep them encouraged, and then harder attacks that require more effort to learn to create the sense of accomplishment. Of course, every player learns in different ways, and almost certainly the learning curve will never look like this. But the closer approximation to this shape is, the better. Good part is that it is only shape we really care about. If the player is more or less experienced, this graph will condense or stretch, but will remain its function. The issue starts when we observe plateau on this graph. It is basically indicates that the player tries again and again, but feels no progress, and this is where frustration kicks in. This'll sound, but obviously this metric is a product of many other parameters and means nothing by itself. So let's discuss some key factors that can influence this curve. Clarity of references. This is the most fundamental part of the boss fight or any fight. The learning of every boss move consists of 3 steps, and even if the player doesn't explicitly think about them in this way, it is how they develop response patterns. First, identifying the reference point for the attack. Second, understanding the right actions for avoidance. Third, polishing the execution. Obviously, the first step is a bottleneck of our described process, and it doesn't matter how simple and easy the attack is, if it doesn't have clear references, learning it will be nothing short of pain in the ass, and I doubt many people will find this a good experience. Some obvious issues with this are animation not matching hitboxes, camera or effects obscuring the enemy movement, very similar wind-up animation for different attack patterns. It is also very important to give the player at least a vague idea of how to actually avoid the attack. And well, I will be coming back to Malenia and her infamous waterfowl dance a few times in the course of this video, because honestly, this move is the masterclass in ruining a very decent boss. This move lacks the above-mentioned clarity, and because of that, experience of the player facing this boss was heavily dependent on the fact of using the guides. If you get the knowledge from the guides, then this move is still not easy to avoid, but I wouldn't say it requires any supernatural talent or a lot of time. It can be further simplified by using shield and basically trivialized by using freeze pots. However, if you ever try to approach Malenia without this knowledge, this becomes a different story. The chaos this attack creates, especially on the last set of swings, is absolutely unparsable, and the only way to find out what to do with it is to try different stuff again and again, basically throwing things into the wall and seeing what sticks, with essentially no guidance. And this is exactly what creates this plateau in the learning curve and the frustration. I wanted to mention that initially I called this section visual clarity, but then I realized that visuals is not the only channel we can get information from as players. It could also be sound or even controller vibration. Right now I'm playing Hi-Fi Rush, game is awesome by the way, and because everything happens on the music beat, you basically can parry attacks that come even off screen and you can't see anything at all. Yet player is capable to land a consistent parry thanks to this timing system. The next key factor shaping the learning curve is diversity of the enemy moveset. Let's again aim for the average player to spend 60 minutes on the boss. Difficulty of the boss can be adjusted by 3 different ways. By changing the complexity of the moves, by changing moveset size, so introducing new moves or removing the moves, or by changing basic stats like HP and damage of the boss. Let's set the third one aside for now. I will be covering it in the next part of the video, but short story, I think it is good only for the fine-tuning but not to overall difficulty settings. Basically, we can make the boss have 10 different moves with variable difficulty, or we can have 20 easier moves, or maybe just 2 extra hardcore waterfowl dance level moves one-shotting the player. Well, by this time it should be obvious that third option is a bloody terrible idea. This will put player in a very discouraging situation where from the very start they try again and again with no visible progress, rendering the boss nearly impossible, even if it is not so. The biggest offender on this subject I can think of is Spawn of Ogdo from Jedi Survivor. This boss is absolutely atrocious. So the first thought could be, yeah, so lots of simple moves is a much better idea. Well, not quite. At some point the moveset will become oversaturated, and because of that it will be harder and harder to create distinct animations for different moves, negatively impacting clarity of the references. So, to a certain degree it will be fine, but what if we want to create a very challenging boss? Well, there are 2 ways successfully used right now I can think of. First, chaining the moves. Basically, instead of creating a super complex long moves, the boss utilizes the chain of simpler moves, providing the opening in between combos. Even without blowing up the moveset, this will create an extra layer of complexity and challenge. At the start, the player will have an opportunity to learn how to react to the basic moves themselves, later understanding how the boss changed those moves in combos and finding the openings. A very good example of this approach are Valkyrie Queens from 2 latest God of War games. The second way is phases. This approach splits moveset in 2 or 3, preventing it from blowing up. It also allows to reuse moves introducing in phase 1 and make them more complex for phase 2. In this case, the player will be challenged with more moves that are difficult to avoid, but will be provided with a learning opportunity, making it overall a more enjoyable experience. Obviously, this approach is heavily idealized by FromSoft games in general, but the pinnacle of it has to be one of the coolest boss fights of all time in my opinion, Saint Sword Ishin from Sekiro. 4 phases, with phases 1, 2, and 3 being completely different, and phase 4 being an iteration over phase 3. Damage and survivability. As I mentioned in the previous section, This is not the greatest parameter to change the boss difficulty. It is okay for some fine-tuning, but in general it should be defined by the boss moveset instead of being mechanism to change the boss difficulty. If the balance is shifted towards high HP and low damage, this is what we call spongy boss. Bosses like this do not create a feeling of a threat and simply frustrate players by how long it takes to defeat them. If the balance is shifted other direction, low HP and high damage, this gives RNG way too much of a saying in the fight, to the degree where the player can beat the boss just because the boss decided to use their scariest ultimate move only one time. Yeah, Malenia, I am looking at you again, because, well, that's exactly how I beat her my first time. If both survivability and damage are way too high, it simply feels unfair, because without the way of pushing through with sheer luck, players have to get back to learning, where learning opportunities are way too short. Don't forget, load screens are real, runs from respawn points are real, the buff times are real. And if both survivability and damage are way too low, well, this is why I can't remember a single mini-boss from the Elden Ring DLC, or from the Elden Ring in general, to be honest. What I'm trying to say here that damage and survivability of the boss should reflect its intended difficulty. If it is an entry boss with 5 moves, and we will try to make it a difficult boss by increasing health and damage, this will create a simply frustrating experience. If we to try to do the opposite, by downscaling high-end boss HP and damage, we will waste its potential. Very important note, the more game is RPG and less action, the harder it is to get this aspect right. If we are talking pure action games like Devil May Cry or Hi-Fi Rush, there is no such thing as build. Character damage is fixed and survivability can be only slightly boosted by collectibles, making adjustment of the boss stats as easy task as it's possible. Then we venture into games like Sekiro that have limited opportunities to manipulate characters' damage and survivability, plus some consumables can influence the experience, but it still usually stays within a very tight bracket. Then we have action-adventure games like God of War Reboot with, let's call it, RPG-light elements, or whatever. It allows for some build flexibility, yet every stat is constrained by the game, and in general remains within the cap. But already here some of the troubles with balancing can be observed. Super tanky builds and glass cannon builds experience become very distinct and can push the game to something ridiculous in some situations. On top of that, with semi-open world structure, when and with what level you get to the boss becomes extremely important. And coming from pure action games on one side of the spectrum, we got to something like Elden Ring on the other, which, while possessing action components, in my opinion, is an RPG game in the first place. Building this game means everything, and yeah, you can be a real man and defeat bosses with almost no gear, or you can create a crazy annihilator, press weapon art a few times, and destroy the seemingly hard boss without learning 2/3 of its moves. Don't get me wrong here, it's not so much a criticism of the Elden Ring or Dark Souls, quite opposite in fact. While from the action mechanics points of view there are things to be desired, putting those in the context of an RPG game with such a huge variety of builds, I think it's kinda insane. Anyways, this concludes my take on the boss difficulty question. Was the Elden Ring Shadow of Erdtree too hard, or were boss battles fun and enjoyable? Well, I think my opinion on it doesn't really matter much, especially considering I mostly adore those games for different reasons. But I am interested to hear your take on it. Did you guys enjoy it? Can you think of reasons why you did or did not enjoy a certain boss battle? What game, in your opinion, has highest quality boss fights? My choice is Sekiro, by the way. Yeah, and that's it for today. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.